Captain Avery Johnson had been pushing papers at the supply depot for 3 months when the invasion began. The base commander barely glanced at her when the alarm started screaming. Just another logistics officer scrambling to account for missing inventory while real warriors prepared to fight. Nobody questioned why she kept her flight suit in her locker. Nobody wondered why she disappeared to the flight line every dawn before her shift. And absolutely nobody suspected that the quiet woman who tracked ammunition requisitions had over 200 combat hours flying the deadliest close air support aircraft ever built. But when enemy armor rolled across the Serbian border and NATO's entire defensive line started collapsing, when every fighter pilot was either dead or pinned down, she did something that changed everything. She walked past the officers shouting into radios, climbed into a cockpit that wasn't supposed to exist on that base, and reminded an entire invading army why the A-10 Warthog earned its reputation one thunderous burst at a time. Before we show you what really happened when she lit up that sky, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and hit subscribe. Because what happened next turned a forgotten logistics captain into the single reason an entire enemy division wished they'd never crossed that border. The coffee in the supply depot's break room tasted like burnt rubber filtered through despair, but Captain Avery Johnson drank it anyway. 05:30 hours, and she was already on her second cup, staring at a computer screen that listed munitions expenditure rates with all the excitement of watching paint dry in slow motion. Outside the reinforced windows, Pristina Air Base was coming to life with its usual morning rhythm. Transport aircraft taxiing, maintenance crews shouting over engine noise, the distant crack of small arms, fire from the training ranges echoing across the tarmac. She was 32, which was young for a captain, but ancient for someone who'd spent the last decade in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II before a bureaucratic nightmare and a medical review board had temporarily grounded her. Average height, athletic build hidden under a uniform that had spent too many days behind a desk. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that was slightly too tight, giving her a severe look that discouraged casual conversation. Brown eyes that tracked movement with the kind of precision that came from calculating lead angles and threat vectors at 300 knots. The supply depot smelled like diesel fuel, old paper, and the particular kind of frustration that came from managing inventory for an entire NATO forward operating base. Rows of metal shelving stretched back into shadows, stacked with everything from MRES to medical supplies to crates of ammunition that Avery knew by sight, sound, and the way they shifted weight during transport. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her assistant and the closest thing she had to a friend on this base, walked in carrying a clipboard and wearing his usual expression of mild bewilderment. 24 years old, fresh from officer training, still idealistic enough to believe that proper paperwork could solve most problems. "Captain, we've got a discrepancy in the 30mm ammunition count," he said, setting the clipboard on her desk. "Warehouse says we have 15,000 rounds. The manifest says 12,000. The flight line says they need 20,000. Avery glanced at the numbers without really seeing them. Her attention was fixed on something else, the way the morning light was catching the edge of the flight line visible through the far windows. The way shadows fell across concrete, painted with faded yellow markers that directed aircraft to and from hangars most people on this base didn't even know existed. "Split the difference in requisition, another 10,000 from Ramstein," she said automatically. "Priority shipment. Use the emergency authorization code." Webb blinked. "Ma'am, that code is only for combat situations." "Then I guess it's a good thing we're sitting on the edge of a potential combat zone, Lieutenant." He wanted to argue. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. But 3 months of working with her had taught him that Captain Johnson's hunches about military logistics had an uncomfortable tendency to be correct. He picked up his clipboard and headed back into the warehouse depths, muttering something about paperwork and regulations. Avery returned her attention to the window, to the section of the base where 3 hangars sat in permanent shadow, their doors closed, their interiors classified at levels that made most of the base command structure nervous. She had been watching those hangars for 3 months, noting the patterns of security patrols, memorizing shift changes, cataloging the subtle signs of maintenance activity that most people wouldn't recognize as significant. Because inside one of those hangars sat an aircraft that officially didn't exist. An A-10 Thunderbolt II that had been quietly moved to Pristina as part of a rapid response deterrent force, then quietly forgotten when political priorities shifted and budgets got reallocated. The base commander knew about it the way someone knows about an embarrassing relative they don't talk about at family dinners. The aircraft was listed on inventory sheets that nobody read, maintained by a crew that operated in bureaucratic shadows, waiting for orders that would probably never come. Avery knew about it because she'd made it her business to know, because she'd spent 2 months cross-referencing maintenance logs and fuel consumption reports until she'd found the ghost entries that proved something was being kept operational in Hangar 7. And because every morning before her shift officially started, she walked to that hangar, showed credentials that technically gave her access to every supply-related facility on base, and spent an hour in the cockpit of that forgotten Warthog, running through pre-flight checks and system diagnostics that kept her skills sharp and the aircraft ready, just in case. The alert sirens started at 06:15 hours, turning the morning from routine to chaos in the space of 3 electronic wails. Avery was on her feet before the second siren finished, coffee forgotten, already moving toward the command bunker with the kind of purposeful stride that made people get out of her way without understanding why. Webb appeared at her shoulder, face pale, eyes wide. "What's happening?" he asked, shouting over the sirens and the sudden roar of jet engines spinning up across the base. "We're about to find out," Avery replied, but she already had a cold certainty settling in her gut, the kind of certainty that came from understanding how geopolitical tensions worked, how small conflicts escalated into bigger ones, how warnings got ignored until it was too late. The command bunker was organized chaos, officers crowding around tactical displays, radio operators shouting updates in 3 different languages, the base commander, Colonel Harrison, standing in the center of it all like a lighthouse in a storm. He was 50, gray-haired, competent in the way the career officers were, when they'd spent their entire lives preparing for situations exactly like this one. "Serbian paramilitary forces crossed the border 90 minutes ago," he was saying, voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Mechanized infantry supported by main battle tanks. Estimate battalion strength, maybe more. They've already overrun 2 border checkpoints and are pushing toward our outer perimeter." Someone asked about air support. Someone else mentioned NATO response protocols and authorization timelines. Harrison's expression said he already knew those answers and didn't like them. "All available air assets are engaged elsewhere or unavailable. Ramstein's scrambling a response package, but they're 2 hours out minimum, maybe 3. He paused, letting that sink in. "We have 30 minutes before hostile armor reaches effective firing range of this base." 30 minutes. Avery did the math instinctively. Response times, deployment options, available assets. It wasn't enough, not even close. The base's ground defenses were substantial, but designed to hold against light infantry, not main battle tanks. Without air support, without time to evacuate, they were looking at casualties that would make headlines and policy changes that would come too late for the people who'd be dead. "What about close air support?" someone asked. "Don't we have anything on site?" Harrison's face tightened. "Nothing operational. The A-10 in Hangar 7 is officially non-deployable. No pilot, no authorization, no... I can fly it." The words came out of Avery's mouth before her brain could fully process what she was saying. Every eye in the bunker turned toward her. This logistics captain who pushed papers and managed inventory, suddenly volunteering for a mission that would make sense only for a qualified CAS pilot. Harrison's expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read. Captain Johnson, with respect, your supply corps. Flying combat missions isn't exactly... I have 200 hours in the A-10C, Avery interrupted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to spike through her system. 3,000 total flight hours, combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was flying Warthogs out of Bagram before a medical review board grounded me for sleep apnea. She met his gaze directly. The aircraft in Hangar 7 is operational. I know because I've been maintaining flight readiness on it every morning for 3 months. And right now, it's the only thing standing between this base and an armor column that's going to roll right through our front gate unless someone stops them. The silence in the bunker was absolute. Even the radio chatter seemed to pause as everyone processed what they had just heard. Webb was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "Ma'am, you never mentioned—" "There was nothing to mention, Lieutenant." Avery's attention was fixed on Harrison, waiting for the decision that would either save lives or condemn them. "Sir, you need that aircraft in the air. I can put it there." Harrison studied her for a long moment, calculating risks and options with the kind of speed that came from decades of military decision-making. Finally, he turned to his operations officer. "Get Captain Johnson to Hangar 7. Full weapons loadout, everything that bird can carry. Authorization code Tango Echo 7. He looked back at Avery. "You've got 20 minutes to be wheels up, Captain." "Make them count." Avery was already moving toward the door. Behind her, she heard Webb's voice. "What about the supply depot?" She paused just long enough to look back. "Figure it out, Lieutenant. You're in charge now." Then she was running. The flight line was controlled madness. Ground crews scrambling to secure loose equipment, transport aircraft taxiing toward the runway, soldiers taking defensive positions behind blast walls and sandbag barriers. Avery ignored all of it. Her focus narrowed to a single target, Hangar 7, sitting in its usual shadows, its doors still closed. The security checkpoint barely slowed her down. She flashed credentials, barked authorization codes, and the guard stepped aside with expressions that suggested they'd just witnessed something they didn't fully understand, but were smart enough not to question. The hangar doors were already opening by the time she reached them, grinding apart on hydraulics that protested the sudden urgency. Inside, emergency lights cast everything in harsh, white illumination that turned shadows into knife edges. And there it sat. The A-10C Thunderbolt II, Warthog tank killer, the ugliest aircraft ever built, and the most beautiful thing Avery had seen in 3 months. Gray-green camouflage paint, twin turbofan engines mounted high above the fuselage, and the massive GAU-8 Avenger 30mm rotary cannon slung beneath the nose like the promise of retribution, made physical. The maintenance crew chief was already there, a grizzled master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been keeping this bird operational on paperwork that barely existed. He looked at Avery with knowing eyes. "Figured someone would remember her eventually," he said, gesturing to where the weapons crew was already loading Maverick missiles onto wing pylons. "She's fully fueled, systems green, cannon loaded with 1,150 rounds. We're hanging 6 AGM-65s, rocket pods, and an AIM-9 just in case someone gets stupid." "How long?" Avery asked, already walking toward the aircraft, her hands reaching for the flight suit that Kowalski's crew had apparently already retrieved from her locker. 12 minutes for full combat load. You'll be cutting it close." "Story of my life, Sergeant." She stripped down to her base layer and climbed into the flight suit with motions that came from muscle memory carved deep by repetition. Nomex fabric that smelled like jet fuel and old sweat, harness straps that settled into familiar grooves across her shoulders, helmet that fit like it had been molded specifically for her head because it had been, back when she was still officially a pilot instead of a logistics officer managing spreadsheets. By the time she finished her pre-flight walk-around, the weapons crew was securing the last Maverick. Kowalski met her at the ladder to the cockpit. "You remember how to fly this thing, Captain?" Avery's smile was thin and sharp. "Like riding a bike, Sergeant, just faster and with more explosions." She climbed into the cockpit and everything else fell away. The chaos outside, the impossible timeline, the career she'd probably just ended by volunteering for an unauthorized combat mission, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the aircraft, the mission, and the calculations already running through her head about approach vectors and target acquisition parameters. The A-10's cockpit was cramped, utilitarian, built around a single purpose: getting ordnance onto targets and bringing the pilot home alive. Avery's hands moved through the startup sequence with the kind of automatic precision that came from doing something hundreds of times. Battery switches, fuel pumps, engine start for the left turbofan, then the right. The whole aircraft shuddered as the engine spooled up, that distinctive high-pitched whine building into a steady roar. Systems came online one by one, amber lights transitioning to green as hydraulics pressurized, avionics initialized, weapon systems ran through self-checks. The helmet-mounted display flickered to life, overlaying targeting information across her field of vision in soft green light. Radio chatter filled her headset. Ground control coordinating the defensive perimeter, lookouts calling out enemy positions, the rising note of panic as armor got closer. She switched to the command frequency. "Tower, this is Hog 1-1, requesting immediate takeoff clearance." Brief silence, then Harrison's voice. "Hog 1-1, you are clear for immediate departure. All other traffic is diverted. You have the entire runway." "Copy that, Tower." Hog 1-1 rolling. The tow vehicle pulled the A-10 out of the hangar into morning light that seemed too bright, too normal for what was about to happen. Avery felt the familiar weight of the aircraft around her, 30,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and ordnance designed for one specific job: killing tanks. She released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The Warthog accelerated with deceptive slowness, gaining speed like a freight train building momentum. The runway stretched ahead, and Avery's world narrowed to airspeed indicators and angle of attack gauges. 80 knots, 100, 120, rotation speed. She pulled back gently on the stick, and the A-10 lifted off the runway with the grace of something that had no business flying but did it anyway out of sheer stubborn determination. Landing gear retracted with solid thuds, flaps came up, and she was climbing into a sky that was about to become very crowded. "Tower, Hog 1-1 is airborne. Request target vectors." "Hog 1-1, stand by for target handoff to combat control." A new voice cut into her headset, crisp, professional, carrying the controlled urgency of someone managing a deteriorating tactical situation. "Hog 1-1, this is combat control. We have multiple armor contacts bearing 045 degrees from your position, range 12 kilometers. Mechanized infantry and BTR-ATs, at least 8 T-72 main battle tanks, estimate company strength advancing on base perimeter. Air defense reported as ZSU 23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, location unknown. You're cleared hot on all hostile targets. Rules of engagement, weapons free." Avery's finger found the weapon selector switch. Her thumb hovered over the master arm. "Combat control, confirm you are giving me weapons-free authorization. This is not a drill." "Hog 1-1, that is affirmative. Hostile armor is danger close to friendly positions. You are authorized to engage with all available ordnance." "Copy. Hog 1-1 is rolling in hot." She banked the A-10 into a hard right turn, pulling the aircraft around until her nose pointed toward the coordinates combat control had provided. Through the cockpit glass, she could see smoke rising from the border area. Burning buildings, vehicle fires, the visual signature of an invasion force that had been meeting light resistance and moving with confidence. That confidence was about to become a liability. Avery descended to 8,000 feet, eyes scanning the ground, correlating what she saw with the tactical display feeding her real-time updates. And there they were, a column of armored vehicles moving in tactical formation across open terrain, clearly visible against the pale ground. 8 T-72 tanks spaced at proper intervals, surrounded by BTR-80 armored personnel carriers, advancing with the kind of measured pace that suggested they expected minimal opposition. They were wrong. She armed the first AGM-65 Maverick missile, letting the seeker head scan for targets. The missile's infrared sensor found hot engine signatures almost immediately. Tanks were easy to spot when their power plants were running full throttle. She locked onto the lead T-72, waited for solid tone, then squeezed the trigger. Rifle 1. The Maverick dropped from the wing pylon, rocket motor igniting with a bright flare as it accelerated toward its target. Avery didn't watch it impact. She was already acquiring the second tank, locking the next Maverick, firing again. Rifle 2. The first missile hit with devastating precision, striking the lead T-72's turret and detonating with the kind of explosion that turned 40 tons of Soviet armor into scrap metal and smoke. The second impact came 3 seconds later, another tank erupting into flames as its ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion that lit up the morning like a miniature sun. Chaos erupted in the enemy formation. BTRS broke formation, searching for cover that didn't exist on open ground. The remaining T-72s tried to disperse, but they were reacting to a threat they couldn't see, couldn't target, couldn't fight. Avery fired her third and fourth Mavericks in quick succession, watching through her targeting pod as 2 more tanks died in fireballs of their own making. The enemy column was completely disrupted now, vehicles scattering in panic, commanders probably screaming into radios about air attack and demanding their own air cover. But the sky belonged to the Warthog. She came around for her gun run, descending to 5,000 feet, nose dropping into the shallow dive that positioned the GAU-8 cannon for optimal engagement. The targeting reticle settled over a cluster of BTRS that had stopped to deploy infantry. Hog 1-1 is in hot with gun. Her finger found the trigger. She squeezed. The GAU-8 Avenger spoke with the voice of God deciding someone had made bad decisions. A sound like the universe tearing itself apart as the 7-barrel rotary cannon spat 30mm depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. Each projectile was designed to penetrate armor, and at this range, BTR-80s might as well have been made of cardboard. The first BTR came apart like it had been hit by a giant hammer, armor plating shredding under the impact of rounds that turned metal into Swiss cheese and everything inside into casualties. Avery walked the cannon fire across 2 more vehicles, watching through her HUD as the iconic nose vibration of the firing cannon made the entire aircraft shudder. She pulled up, climbing away from the kill zone, already scanning for the next target. Behind her, the enemy column was no longer advancing. It was dying. 5 tanks destroyed, 4 BTRS wrecked, infantry scattered and taking cover wherever they could find it. But she wasn't done. Combat control, Hog 1-1. First wave is neutralized. Do you have additional targets? Hog 1-1, affirmative. Second wave of armor has been identified 3 kilometers behind your current targets. Estimate 6 additional tanks, multiple support vehicles. Also be advised, ZSU-23-4 is active in your vicinity. Recommend extreme caution. The warning came a half-second too late. Avery's threat receiver screamed, radar warning symbol lighting up her display with the unmistakable signature of a ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a Soviet self-propelled anti-aircraft gun with 4 rapid-fire cannons designed specifically to kill low-flying aircraft. She broke hard left, dumping chaff and flares, the A-10 responding with the maneuverability of something that wasn't supposed to turn this tight, but did it anyway. Tracers arced through the space where she'd been 2 seconds earlier, bright lines of death that would have torn her aircraft apart. The Shilka was good. Whoever was operating it knew their business. They were tracking her turn, adjusting fire, boxing her into a corner where evasion would become mathematically impossible. But Avery Johnson hadn't survived 200 combat hours by playing fair. She reversed her turn mid-maneuver, a move that violated every sensible flight principle, but worked because the A-10 was built by people who understood that sometimes pilots needed to do impossible things. The Shilka's operator lost tracking for just a second, and a second was all she needed. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove toward the enemy position with her last 2 Mavericks already armed and locked. The radar warning was still screaming, tracers were still reaching for her, and she was diving straight into the teeth of an anti-aircraft system that had killed better pilots than her. Rifle 3, Rifle 4, she called, voice steady despite pulling 6 Gs in a dive that made her vision gray at the edges. Both Mavericks launched simultaneously. She didn't wait to confirm hits. She pulled up hard, climbing away, feeling the airframe protest under stress, loads it wasn't designed for but would tolerate because this was exactly the kind of abuse the Warthog was built to survive. Behind her, 2 explosions occurred almost simultaneously as both missiles found their target. The ZSU-23-4's radar signature vanished from her threat display, replaced by the visual of a burning wreck that would never threaten aircraft again. "Shilka is down," she reported, circling back toward the second armor wave that Combat Control had identified. "Engaging second wave." She had 2 Mavericks left, rocket pods still full, and 600 rounds remaining in the cannon, more than enough to finish the job. The second armor wave never had a chance. They'd seen what happened to the first column, witnessed tanks reduced to burning metal by an aircraft they couldn't effectively fight, and their morale was already breaking before Avery made her first pass. She came in from their flank, using terrain masking to hide her approach until she popped up over a ridgeline like death arriving on schedule. The remaining 2 Mavericks killed 2 more T-72s before the enemy could react. Then she was in among them with the gun, making pass after pass, each burst of 30mm fire, dismantling vehicles and destroying the will to fight. By the time she pulled off target, the second wave wasn't an armor column anymore. It was a collection of burning vehicles and scattered infantry who'd abandoned their equipment and were running for the border they'd crossed with such confidence barely an hour earlier. "Combat Control, Hog 1-1. All immediate threats neutralized. Enemy forces are in full retreat. I have Winchester on missiles, approximately 400 rounds remaining in gun. Request battle damage assessment and additional tasking." The response came not from Combat Control, but from Colonel Harrison himself. His voice carried something that might have been awe or relief, or the kind of exhaustion that came from watching impossible situations resolve themselves through sheer force of will. "Hog 1-1, return to base. Outstanding work, Captain. You just saved this entire installation." Avery brought the A-10 around in a long, lazy turn, pointing her nose back toward Pristina Air Base. The aircraft felt lighter now without the missiles, and she could see smoke from the destroyed enemy column staining the sky behind her. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied. But inside, she was smiling. Because this right here, in the cockpit of an aircraft designed to do one thing better than anything else in the world, this was where she belonged. Not pushing papers in a supply depot, not managing inventory spreadsheets. But here, in the sky, making impossible decisions at 300 knots and reminding the world why the A-10 Warthog was still the most feared close air support aircraft ever built. The landing was textbook perfect. Wheels touching down exactly on the numbers, engines spooling down as she taxied off the active runway. Ground crews were waiting, and behind them, she could see what looked like half the base command staff standing at attention. She shut down the engines, completed her post-flight checks with the same methodical precision she'd used to start the mission, then popped the canopy and climbed down. Colonel Harrison was the first to reach her, and his expression was complicated. Relief mixed with something that looked like he was reassessing every assumption he'd ever made about logistics officers. "Captain Johnson," he said formally. Then he stopped, shook his head, and his expression shifted to something warmer. "Hell of a job up there." "Thank you, sir." Avery pulled off her helmet, feeling 3 months of desk work frustration evaporate like morning dew. The aircraft performed exactly as expected, and the pilot exceeded all expectations. Harrison paused, clearly wrestling with something. "I'm going to have questions. Starting with why an A-10 pilot with your record was rotated to Supply Corps instead of getting back in the cockpit where you clearly belong." Avery's expression remained neutral. "Medical review board, sir. Sleep apnea. They grounded me pending further evaluation. The paperwork got delayed." "The paperwork," Harrison repeated slowly, "got delayed." "For 3 months, sir. I submitted all required documentation, kept myself flight current, maintained aircraft readiness on the only operational Warthog we had, purely as a precautionary measure, of course." Harrison's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile trying not to show itself in public. Of course, purely precautionary. He pulled out his radio. "Get me personnel command, priority 1. I need Captain Johnson's medical review board results expedited and her flight status reactivated immediately. Authorization comes from me, personally." Behind him, Webb was staring at Avery like she was a completely different person than the captain who'd been managing ammunition inventory an hour earlier. "Ma'am, I have so many questions." "Later, Lieutenant," Avery replied, but she was smiling now, really smiling, for the first time in months. "Right now, I believe Master Sergeant Kowalski and I need to discuss maintenance schedules for that aircraft, because something tells me she's going to be flying a lot more missions in the near future." The debriefing took 3 hours. Avery walked the command staff through every decision, every shot, every tactical consideration that had turned an impossible situation into a decisive victory. The battle damage assessment confirmed 13 destroyed tanks, 11 destroyed armored personnel carriers, 1 destroyed anti-aircraft system, and enemy casualties estimated in the hundreds. The invasion had been stopped cold. Serbian paramilitary forces had withdrawn across the border and weren't showing any signs of trying again. NATO reinforcements were arriving, but they weren't needed anymore. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 1 perfect execution of close air support doctrine had accomplished what an entire defense strategy was supposed to achieve. When the formal questions ended and the officers filed out, Harrison gestured for Avery to stay behind. He closed the door, poured 2 glasses of whiskey that were definitely not regulation, but absolutely appropriate, and handed her one. "Off the record," he said quietly, "how long have you been planning this?" Avery considered the question, took a sip of whiskey that burned exactly right. "I wasn't planning anything, sir. I just wanted to be ready if the opportunity came. Turned out it did. The opportunity came because you made sure it would. Keeping that aircraft operational, maintaining your flight currency, positioning yourself to volunteer when the moment arrived." He studied her over his glass. "That's not luck, Captain. That's preparation, meeting opportunity. Someone once told me the only difference between being lucky and being good is that luck runs out eventually." Harrison laughed, a short bark of sound that held genuine appreciation. "Your medical review board clearance came through 20 minutes ago. Fully cleared for flight status, all restrictions lifted. Apparently, someone at medical command saw footage of your mission and decided sleep apnea wasn't really relevant for a pilot who just stopped an invasion." "Funny how that works," Avery said dryly. "I'm reassigning you effective immediately. Advanced Tactical Air Control Squadron, full flight duty, with a recommendation for commendation and immediate promotion consideration." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer to go back to Supply Corps." "I'm sure Lieutenant Webb would appreciate the help with ammunition inventory." Avery's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I think Lieutenant Webb will manage just fine without me, sir. He's more capable than he knows." "Then welcome back to where you belong, Captain." Harrison raised his glass. "To preparation, opportunity, and knowing when to break the rules for the right reasons." They drank to that. The story of what happened at Pristina Air Base spread through military channels with the speed of really good gossip that happened to also be completely true. Captain Avery Johnson became something of a legend, the logistics officer who turned out to be one of the deadliest close air support pilots in NATO, the quiet professional who'd been hiding in plain sight until the moment came to remind everyone why the A-10 Warthog would never be truly obsolete. Lieutenant Webb took over the supply depot and ran it with efficiency that surprised everyone, including himself. He kept a photo on his desk. Captain Johnson in her flight suit, standing next to the A-10 that saved the base, looking exactly like what she'd always been underneath the spreadsheets and inventory reports. Master Sergeant Kowalski and his crew maintained that Warthog with religious devotion, knowing they'd kept something important alive during the dark months when nobody was paying attention. Sometimes the most critical maintenance isn't on the aircraft. It's making sure the right pilot can find their way back to the cockpit when it matters most. The enemy forces never tried crossing that border again, not because of diplomatic negotiations or political pressure, but because somewhere in their operational planning, someone had written a single sentence that carried more weight than any treaty. Be advised, NATO has A-10s operational in theater, with pilots cleared for immediate combat deployment. And in a ready room somewhere in Eastern Europe, Captain Avery Johnson sat in a briefing, planning the next mission, surrounded by other pilots who understood what she'd always known, that the most dangerous people are often the ones nobody's watching, and the most important skills are the ones you maintain even when nobody thinks you'll ever need them again, because wars don't wait for paperwork to clear. Invasions don't care about organizational charts, and sometimes the person who saves everything is the one everybody thought was just pushing papers and managing inventory. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep, but when the sheep are in danger, it's nice to know there's a wolf on your side. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories of brave women in uniform.